right, this is Chris and Mother Speak Podcast, where we discuss Black LGBT issues and topics. And my guest today, history professor and author of the book we're discussing today, Not Straight, Not White, that examines the lives of both Black gay activists, both famous and little known, in telling an overlooked history of Black gay men who were both inspired and marginalized through movements for social change. Please welcome Mr. Kevin Mumford. How are you?
Oh, I'm fine. I'm glad to talk to you.
All right. I'm very glad to talk to you, too. I'll be honest with you. I'm a big history fan. I love history. And one thing about the gay history was something I never really truly explored myself, but I always wanted to kind of find more books about it. I know I've seen some things pertaining to art, the art movement, but definitely one of those things pertaining to just history and the social activists was something also of an interest to me, and I'm sure it's going to be an interest for the fans. Well, can you tell me a little bit in terms of why did you write this book?
Well, first of all, I am a Black gay historian, and I realized after writing 2 books that there still wasn't much material on the intersection of gay history and African American history, and particularly about Black gay politics. And so I was lucky enough to win a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship at the Schomburg Library, world famous collection of African American and African archival materials up in Harlem. And from there, I started to research the life of a Black gay activist named Joseph Beaton. And I originally thought I would start to work on just his biography, and it kind of just spiraled out from there. And I found much more material, figures, issues than I had expected.
Now, I definitely see that it was definitely well received. How are people actually receiving the book here? It looks like on several resources.
It's really exciting, actually. I feel there was a moment when I was finishing the manuscript and I had a workshop, which is 8 or 9 of my colleagues read it, and we all came together and talked about it. And from there was just a lot of enthusiasm, and so I gained a lot of confidence, and I knew that I was on to something. I figured that it would have a pretty good audience, and it has. Actually, I've gotten very lucky in the sense that it's been a finalist for several awards.
Congratulations.
Yes. It won an award from the American Library Association.
Wow.
And it's up for the Lambda. I don't know if your audience knows the Lambda Literary Awards, but it's kind of like the most prestigious award in LGBT. They honor fiction and nonfiction.
Wow. Congratulations on that. Wow.
Thanks. Yeah.
So this has been a good little ride for you, definitely when it comes to this piece of history. Did you find that a lot of some of your white counterparts also find it very surprising in terms of what you found?
I think yes. I think that LGBT studies is overwhelmingly an overwhelmingly white field, and most of the subjects, whether it's movements or individual actors, are white. And so I think pretty much everything in the book comes as something of a surprise to mainstream LGBT scholars. In the first part of the book, I do talk about more well-known figures such as Bayard Rustin and James Baldwin. But much of the book really is about lesser-known activists.
Okay.
People that were important for their time, but have not really been written about.
And when you found that, what type of, because this is what I normally find. I normally find that those who are a little bit older, who definitely remember, those times, or either actually kind of know some information, they seem to be a little bit more interested. Are you getting a lot of younger audience who are also kind of appealing to the book or looking for this information?
Yes. One of the things I was hoping for in the book was to try to make the writing more accessible. Some of LGBT studies, particularly queer studies, is very theoretical, and they have a lot of debates that operate at that level, sort of high theory, literary theory, cultural theory. And I kind of made a decision, kind of a deliberate move, to keep the prose straightforward, to tell stories, particularly biographical stories, because I knew that younger students, particularly like undergraduates, would take to it, that they would, be more entertained. And then also there were stories of lives that they would be able to identify with. People who had to negotiate their religion and their sexual identity, had to figure out how to work with family and fit in communities. And also, for example, one chapter talks about a black activist who was, trying to go to school and trying to go to graduate school, and yet was sort of in the closet, and that was very difficult for him. So, I guess I was hoping to make it accessible and also to relate to a younger generation of both black and white students about what it meant for these men to kind of negotiate the intersection of race and sexuality.
What did you find most surprising?
One of the things that was surprising was how important religion was. I mean, as a scholar of African American history, I know that the black church and religion have been crucial in slavery, to foster community. Certainly in the civil rights movement, many leaders were religious leaders in local communities. The churches would be places where people would meet and construct strategy for demonstrations. But I hadn't imagined how important, I hadn't really predicted how important faith would be in this story. Certainly James Baldwin, would have alerted us to that, because all of his works deal with, on some level, questions of faith and spirituality. But I also found, for example, an activist who, right after he graduated from high school, went into a Catholic order called the Order of Salvatorians, which was based in Milwaukee.
Okay.
And they were dedicated, they were dedicated to social service, to chastity, and to advocacy for social justice. And so he was very important in the 1970s, trying to reconcile his faith with his commitment to gay liberation. And so he really identified himself as the first, or as a major advocate of what he called black gay liberation in the 1970s.
Wow. Well, let me ask you, why don't many people know about this history? Is it something that was really suppressed with purpose from the different parts, or why?
That's a great question. In some ways, I think, on the one hand, LGBT studies, which is still relatively new, although it's exploded, so it's become, there are just more and more panels at conferences, and every gender studies department worth its salt has somebody who specializes in gay and lesbian history. But again, those departments and scholars are overwhelmingly white, and they just, you go to school and you start to specialize in, certain fields, and they can I think in reality, they don't study African American history,
right,
especially by the time they're in graduate school. So they just sort of miss the connections between LGBT history and African American history. Wow. And, on the other side, the kind of canon of African American studies is pretty traditional. And so many scholars who are aware of someone like James Baldwin, that's one thing, but to kind of branch out and think about black gay novelists, including them in the canon, or thinking about the connections between the civil rights movement and the gay rights movement, that's a harder sell, I found, when I talk to my colleagues in African American studies. They tend to have sometimes pretty traditional ideas about what social movements are and what counts as a civil right, and what counts as, sort of legitimate. And oftentimes there's a certain level of resistance or even homophobia in traditional African American studies communities.
Wow. So really, in many cases, we've just kind of ignored it, but because of those particular cultural beliefs, we just kind of said push it to the side. Because I remember someone telling me when it came down to, I think, the last Million Man March, it was a kind of a deal to even get someone of African American descent who was also gay to even speak. It was kind of an issue.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that the presence of Louis Farrakhan, who was sort of, very conservative and outspoken, and then just a very traditional conception of black masculinity and kind of respectability. They often, sometimes, I think unwittingly, they just sort of marginalize gay men, the expression of gayness. That, especially I think in public politics, there is a tendency to want to put a unified, singular face of blackness. Okay. And there's a very famous scholar, Kathy Cohen, who wrote a book on AIDS and black politics. One of the arguments that she makes, that I think is right, is that it's not, the African American political communities aren't intrinsically homophobic. It's just that they tend to want to organize around a single identity. And anybody who kind of challenges that or tries to pluralize that often gets a lot of pushback. Right. And so I think that's, to some extent, I think that's still the case. I think that, I wrote a paper recently called Black Gay Lives Matter, where I talk about, there's a long tradition of trying to, of black gay men trying to be represented, be taken as humane and human, to, have respect in the public sphere. And even today, I think there's a problem of invisibility, which I think is really, which as I argue in the book, is very problematic in terms of self-esteem. That one of the things a number of my activists are pushing for is kind of self-respect and recognition that they too are contributing, we too are contributing, and that's really important, I think, in terms of staying safe, right? Like the alarming persistence of men of color converting to HIV. And I think part of that has to do with not being included in communities where there's a lot of awareness about safe sex and prevention, right?
Right. I was actually reading some of the abstracts from your book, and one of them I was looking at, the limits of liberation. And just reading this abstract real quick. In the era of black and gay liberation, activists attempted to forge coalitions that only temporarily provided space for black gay men. The Black Panthers fleeting support gay causes, while relatively few black men joined gay liberation fronts. But the beginnings of a new black gay activism were visible. Now, I'll be honest with you, I didn't know. I really didn't know that some of the Black Panthers actually participated in that. But you also mentioned something of Malcolm X. I think you mentioned something about that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, there's been an ongoing controversy around Malcolm X. And it's kind of interesting, when I write about it in the book, I don't try to answer the question, I just sort of observe how controversial it's been, how the back and forth in the fight over Malcolm X has been, and trying to figure out what's at stake in his sort of defenders. And the controversy goes back to a biography that was written in the early 80s by Bruce Perry, where he had found evidence that in the late 1940s, before he went to prison, Malcolm was kind of a hustler. And people had known that he was in the sort of bebop scene, that he was kind of a low-level sort of a criminal. He had some theft
Yes.
issues.
Yes.
Anyways, but that he also had performed massages on men for a price. So there was a kind of low-level hustler prostitution.
Gotcha.
And there was a lot of pushback on this idea that Malcolm could possibly have been bisexual. Lots of controversy. People quite seriously criticized the Perry biography. And it resurfaced again when Manning Marable published his Pulitzer Prize-winning biography in, I think, around 2003, 2004. And he confirmed Perry's findings. He found a letter from the evidence that this homosexual had visited Malcolm in jail, that Malcolm wrote him a letter and he planned to stay with him once he was released, so that there was a sense in which he was relying on him as a kind of source of stability.
Yes.
Ultimately, of course, in prison, Malcolm converts to Islam, and when he comes out, he joins Elijah Muhammad. But there is that clear evidence of connections with this sort of male suitor.
Definitely because the movies that, of course, depicted some of his lies, etc., we definitely knew that he was involved in a lot of things. And, of course, when he gave his life to Islam and just to be part of the movement, he definitely changed a lot of things. So, I think a lot of people will definitely be aware of that. This little piece of history, maybe not so much, that people were a little bit aware of. But
yeah. And I wasn't really trying to, like I said, come down one way or the other, but more trying to figure out why would even the possibility that Malcolm X was bisexual cause so much controversy, that there was this idea, like what was at stake? Why is it so alarming for so many people that this flirtation with homosexuality was such an issue?
Yeah, I guess people, at least from my point of view, some people actually view him such an iconic figure to even still his private life to even be associated with it, especially what it stood for, how much of a masculine person he projected himself and portrayed himself, so a lot of those things I can definitely see comes into play. But, nonetheless, it was something that, of a piece of a history note that most people probably would find definitely surprising within your book. What was also, if you can also give me one more person that you found that you really admired, that's really wasn't really known so much throughout history?
There are things that I admire about James Kinney. And he is a much more controversial character in the book. As a well-known leading researcher, and he had gone to become a professor at Howard University. And one reason, and he was really a brilliant scholar. And when you look through his papers, the kinds of collections that he had on the Black Press and African American religion were just astounding. All of his papers, and he had a lot of fighting to do. I mean, to try to be in the Pentecostal church and be an expert, and then to come out as gay, which he did in 1979, put him at odds with many institutions. Certainly Howard University, it was not easy to be out in an HBCU. Eventually, he faced excommunication from the Pentecostal church for trying to advocate for the inclusion of lesbians. So he was, somebody who had a lot of crises around him in trying to reconcile his relationship to the Black community and to being gay. He's also unusual in that we don't know very much about his background, about his family, where other than to say that he was adopted and he grew up in a white family, but that he understood himself to be African American, and throughout his life, he made choices to become part of Black institutions. And then he went on to try to reconcile me coming out as gay and being part of these institutions.
Wow. So definitely one thing's for sure, that would be one part I would love to look into. Just gotta find out more. And the reason why, because my entire family is Pentecostal and I know that religion. So
right. Yeah. So you can't imagine a harder, a tougher fight.
Yeah.
To try to.
Oh yeah, and when you said that, I'm thinking, oh boy, I can just imagine. That would be definitely one great story for people to walk away with. If anything, I want people to be more aware of your book, Not Straight, Not White. I'm not sure if we said it before. I want to make sure I said it as many times before. So it gives a little piece of history that most of us really have no chance, really didn't have that much of a chance to really follow that much of, because, well, it wasn't really put out there that much. So I really appreciate you writing this book, and I want to put this book out there. I want to give you all the information as much as possible for some of the listeners to be able to go purchase the book on Amazon, to also follow you and some, because you wrote several books. Is that correct?
Yes, it's true. This is my third book. I wrote a book on Newark, New Jersey, and focusing particularly on the riots there. And it's kind of interesting because it's the 50th anniversary of the Newark riots this summer.
Wow.
So yeah, they're having a big symposium, what looks to be a very exciting symposium at the new Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C. So I'm going to be speaking there in July.
Awesome.
And and then my first book was about the Great Migration and sexuality, and it's called Inner Zones, Black-White Sex Districts in Chicago and New York in the early 20th century. So kind of returning to sexuality in my first book there.
I definitely, again, I do appreciate you coming on the show and just kind of giving people a little bit of history that a lot of us just plainly didn't know. And I think this book would kind of do a lot of highlights and kind of give a little bit more of those people who really weren't really given much attention to in history, and kind of give their voice. So I really appreciate you coming on the show. And like I said, I'll definitely put all the information on the podcast so everyone's aware of it. And this is Chris with Brother Speak Podcast, also with Mr. Mumford, Kevin Mumford. And again, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. I look forward to hearing the podcast.
Thank you so much. Got to take a moment to give a big shout out to DJ Baker with the weekly Top 40. There's the first LGBT urban countdown from artists from around the world. Tune in every single Saturday live from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. exclusively on alldigitalradio.com.